After almost 6 months, Daniel Martel doesn't believe Lilly and Jack Sullivan are in the woods near their home in Lansdowne Station.
Everything's been searched at this point, so I think everyone's just looking to, what's the alternate, what could have happened to the case other than being...
It was the moment that sent a shockwave through the entire investigation, when Daniel Martel stepped forward and said, "I don't believe the kids in the woods. They didn't wander in there." It wasn't just a grieving stepfather speaking. It was a man contradicting the very foundation of the initial search. Instantly, the narrative shifted. If the children weren't in the woods, then where were they? This wasn't a random opinion. It came after days of watching helicopters scan the tree line, listening to search dogs run through the underbrush, and hearing professionals say the same shocking thing. No tracks, no clothing, no scent trail, no trace. From that moment, Martel's words ignited a debate, not because they were emotional, but because they were rooted in what the search crews didn't find. Search teams swept through those woods with the precision and coordination of a full-scale military operation. Hundreds of trained volunteers marched shoulder to shoulder, forming tight search grids that covered every hill, ditch, and hollow. Drone units hovered overhead, their cameras scanning the treetops and forest floor for any sign of movement or disturbed earth. Cadaver dogs were brought in to sweep ravines, deep thickets, and rock-filled creek beds, areas humans struggled to navigate without slipping or sinking into the mud. Every resource, every tool, every ounce of manpower was thrown into the search, yet the forest gave nothing back. No clothing, no food wrappers, no tracks, no broken branches that suggested someone had passed recently. Despite the overwhelming force of this operation, the woods remained eerily, almost unnaturally silent, as if Lilly and Jack had never taken a single step inside it. That absence of evidence weighed heavily on everyone involved, but for one man in particular, it shifted everything. Daniel Martel watched these operations unfold day after day. He saw specialists map out the terrain with laser grids and GPS overlays, marking each sector as teams completed their sweeps. He observed how search leaders gathered at dusk, huddled over maps, comparing notes and recalculating probabilities. And each evening the conclusion was identical. Not a single confirmed clue connected to Lilly or Jack had been found within those woods. For a man desperate for answers, that silence didn't just raise questions. It defined the direction of his belief. Martel began to see the forest not as a place where the children were hidden, but as a place that was clearly telling investigators something crucial. They were looking in the wrong place. In his eyes, the quiet wasn't a mystery. It was a message. The children hadn't vanished into the timberline. They hadn't wandered aimlessly into danger. To Martel, the forest wasn't concealing the truth. It was pointing away from it. While police continued pushing the investigation forward, Martel refused to be a passive observer. He didn't wait for updates or rely solely on official reports. He went into the woods himself, day after day, driven by a need to understand what really happened. Sometimes he walked alongside trained search teams, listening closely as they explained how they read terrain, track footprints, and interpret signs of passage. Other times, he went alone, moving slowly along the tree line with nothing but flashlight, a notebook, and his own instincts. Martel traced every path that branched off from the Sullivan property. He followed trails that children might wander down and avoided areas he knew no child would willingly approach. He checked old hunting routes, ATV tracks, and forgotten footpaths known only to locals who had lived there for decades. If a direction was even remotely plausible, he walked it. If a clearing looked out of place, he studied it. If the ground seemed compressed or disturbed, he compared it to older impressions nearby. Few people involved in the search knew the surrounding land the way Martel did. He grew up around terrain like this. He understood how quickly visibility drops once you step into the deep brush, how the forest floor records movement, how easily signs of travel could be spotted even hours later. He knew which ridges were climbable and which ravines were too steep for a child to cross. More importantly, he knew where children naturally tend to go, toward open spaces, recognizable landmarks, areas with sound or movement. But after walking the woods repeatedly and studying every angle with his own eyes, Martel reached a conclusion he couldn't push aside. Nothing, Absolutely nothing about the terrain matched the scenario of two small children disappearing into it. There were no broken branches that suggested rushed movement, no disturbed moss indicating someone had stepped off the main path, no scuff marks, no handprints, no tears in vegetation, no signs of struggle, and crucially, no small barefoot impressions in mud or soft earth. Something investigators usually expect from young children outside for long periods. To Martel, the forest didn't look like a place two scared kids had wandered into. It didn't tell a story of panic or confusion. It didn't show the natural, unplanned path children leave behind when they run or explore. Instead, the woods looked untouched, like a silent backdrop to something that happened elsewhere. In his mind, the forest wasn't the problem, it was the proof. Proof that the children hadn't gotten lost. Proof that their trail didn't begin in those trees at all. When the RCMP finally scaled back the massive ground search, many observers interpreted the decision as a calculated, strategic shift, a sign that investigators were entering a new phase. But for Martel, it was something deeper. To him, it was confirmation of everything he had already seen with his own eyes. Search commanders don't reduce operations casually or prematurely. They don't pull back resources unless they're absolutely certain the area has been examined to exhaustion. And in this case, the woods weren't just searched, they were blanketed. Crews swept the same grids multiple times. Helicopters circled overhead with thermal imaging. Drone teams flew low passes through the canopy. Cadaver dogs were brought in repeatedly, checking ravines, creek beds, and rocky outcroppings known to hold scent longer. Even off-route sections, places children were unlikely to wander, were systematically cleared. There was no guesswork, no shortcuts, no missed corners. Every inch of the forest had been touched, scanned, walked, or analyzed. So when the RCMP scaled down operation, the message was unmistakable. It wasn't that they were giving up. It was that they were shifting focus. Professionals with decades of combined experience had concluded the woods weren't hiding anything relevant anymore. The forest was not the center of the mystery. It was simply the backdrop of the initial response. For Martel, this decision aligned perfectly with everything he had been thinking. If seasoned experts, people who specialize in wilderness searches, missing person patterns, and terrain analysis, believed the forest no longer held answers, why would he continue clinging to it as a primary location? Their actions confirmed his observations. The land wasn't giving clues because the clues weren't there. This realization wasn't driven by blind hope or emotional refusal to accept reality. It wasn't denial. It was synchronization with the evidence, or rather, the absence of evidence. Martel wasn't imagining a new theory. He was following the same logic the RCMP had quietly begun to show through their operational decisions. The conclusion became clear. If the experts were turning their attention elsewhere, then the truth wasn't waiting inside the tree line. It lay beyond it. Two children wandering into dense forest always leave a pattern. Even the smallest ones do. Search experts say that kids don't move through the wilderness like ghosts. They leave tiny signatures of their presence that trained eyes know how to read. A sock snagged on a thorn bush, a shoe print smudged into soft mud, a snapped twig showing a sudden turn, a toy or stick dropped when fear sets in, even the faint trail of human scent that dogs can follow long after a child has passed. These are the natural breadcrumbs of movement, the organic clues that appear simply because children cannot move through the environment without interacting with it. But in this case, none of those things existed. Not a single thread of clothing. Not one scuff mark leading from the yard into the tree line. Not even a partial impression of a small foot in the damp earth. It was as if the children had evaporated at the edge of the property. And to people who understand search operations, that level of nothingness isn't normal. It's alarming. In virtually every case where children genuinely wander into a forest, search teams find something within the first 24 hours. Even in rugged terrain, even in bad weather, kids drop items, drift toward water, leave trails of crushed grass, tug branches down to their height, or create patterns of movement that dogs lock onto instantly. Yet here, despite the most advanced tools available, heat-seeking drones scanning the canopy, infrared sweeps from helicopters, ground units moving in tight formations, water search teams combing creeks and ponds, and highly trained dog units covering miles, Not a single piece of evidence matched Lilly or Jack. Not one confirmed trace tying them to the forest. Martel believed this wasn't just unusual. It was fundamentally impossible under natural circumstances. 2 young children cannot walk into dense wilderness and leave nothing. The absolute absence of trace didn't point to confusion or a missed clue or the randomness of nature. To Martel, it pointed to one clear and undeniable conclusion. The children didn't enter the woods at all. They never stepped into that tree line. Whatever happened to Lilly and Jack